Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you join us today in 3 truths that empower change agents and 7 principles or methods or secrets for leaders to use in bringing about real transformation in individuals, in families, and institutions, companies, nonprofit organizations, and entire societies as we follow Christ. So just really happy to get to know you. We know that this medium is somewhat constricted and that we were supposed to be live, but we'll look to God to help this be meaningful. And we're looking for real transformation today. And we're looking forward to some good questions and some interaction with you. Well, when I was younger, I went through some experiences that I misinterpreted, and they led me to accept some lies as truth. Over time, through the Lord's grace, that changed, and we'll talk about that today. And this is something about the story of how that happened. Thus, the 3 lies being replaced by 3 truths, and then 7 principles or secrets that I learned as God led me through some triumphs and some tragedies, as all of us experience in life. When I was 8 years old, one day I found myself sitting in the passenger seat of the family car. My mother was to my left, and my 2 sisters, younger, were in the back seat. We were leaving Cleveland, Tennessee. My father, who had always been vacillated a lot between being very sad and angry, had gotten to a point where my mother didn't feel that we could live there any longer. And so we got in the car and left my father to go and live with my aunt and uncle who lived 100 miles away in Knoxville, Tennessee. My uncle was there, and just before we pulled out, he looked at me and said, "Jimmy, you're the man of the family now." And we drove away. The strange thing about that departure over time was that my father's name was James, as is mine, but his name was never mentioned in our family. My sisters and I interpreted that to mean that he was very shameful, that if we ever said his name, the adults would be very, very embarrassed. So we didn't. No one ever told us not to, but we just never mentioned him. It was as though he had never existed. That had all sorts of impacts on us, but I've talked to my sisters about it, and one of the things that happened is that we all knew that we were his children, and that if he was so shameful that he was unmentionable, we assumed that we had that shame as well. We didn't know why, and we didn't really think about it, but we all reached that conclusion. My family didn't exclude his name in an attempt to hurt us or make us feel shameful. Our family was loving. They just didn't understand that that would be the impact. When my mom asked all of us 3 kids what we wanted for Christmas, I remember thinking, what I want for Christmas is to see my dad. But I never said that. I always said ping pong table or a bike or something else. It hurts to love someone that never contacts you. Some of you know this through personal experience. And so after a time, I got tired of hurting. And I decided that if he didn't love us, then I didn't love him. And I turned down the feeling of love and tried to just block him from my mind. I stopped feeling. I was asked by my mom to come into the kitchen many years later. I was in high school and to sit at the kitchen table. And she told me that she had some bad news and that my father had passed away. I didn't say anything. I just sat there. I think I was waiting to feel something. I just didn't. If a pet had been killed, run over by a car, I would have felt something, but I did not feel anything. I think I had come to believe as a child that emotions are very dangerous. My father was sad or angry or confused so much of the time. And he ended up losing his family, losing his job, going to a mental institution, and ultimately losing his life as he swam a river after he had left the institution without permission. And he had become so much of a failure that his name was never mentioned by his own family. So I decided I would not feel. And that had killed my father. I was not going to be like my father. The other thing that I decided was that I would try harder than my father did. I really felt like there was a way, if he had just tried harder, not to be sad, or just to come and see us more than once in all those years, that he could have done so. So I decided that without thinking about it, but just it became a belief that my value was dependent on my performance. And so one thing I knew, and that is I would never be like my father. And I would stop feeling, and I would perform well because I just outworked everyone. In fact, I didn't do that in undergraduate school, but when I went to college, I started working very hard, and I've worked hard since then. I was about 20 years old, I guess, when I found myself at Fort Ord, California, at a U.S. Army base, going through basic training and advanced infantry training. And I decided before I went to that fort that the Army, the drill sergeants, the officers, no matter what they did, they would not intimidate me, they would not bully me, they would not make me fearful. I would do my duty, I would learn well, but that I would never experience fear. They would not change the inside of me. I would not allow them to control the inside of me. Well, I was wrong. They didn't make me fearful, but they did make me angry. They uncorked a volcano of anger that I didn't even know existed because I had turned off feelings many years before. And they were very skillful and very strategic in preparing me to be very aggressive and to, they called the infantry the ultimate fighting machine. And that's what they turned us into, and very skillfully. The problem is that once you uncork anger, it's hard to contain. I found some, what I consider to be useful results that I could get from anger. I went to law school, and there we had a mock court competition where the students would compete with one another in a trial. It was, of course, a mock trial, not a true trial, but we had a real judge, and it was in a room that looked like a courtroom, and we would do direct examination and cross-examination, all the kinds of things that you do in trial, and then we were judged. And I found that I had a skill for asking questions that put witnesses in very difficult situations if they weren't telling the truth. And I asked the judge to approach the witness, and I had a new question every few steps as I got closer to him. And when I'm looking at him very close and face to face, I unleashed some of that anger. And I was able to intimidate the witness in front of the judge and many of the students. And he broke. And I won that competition. And I realized that anger was a commodity that could be very useful in the law. It wasn't sufficient to simply be angry. You also needed to work hard and be strategic. But anger was what could really just, at the appropriate moment crush your opponent. In law school, they taught us not so much explicitly, but more implicitly. There was a working view on the part of many of the faculty and many of the students that everything was relative, that much of what we call justice is really just contrived. It's a social construct. Some people there believe, certainly not all, but there was no essential difference to say that anything is any more good than anything else. It's just a matter of preference. In fact, as you know, many in the field of philosophy don't even believe such a thing as evil exists. So that sort of makes a mockery of justice. So there's a lot of irony and a lot of, tongue-in-cheek kinds of talks. And the idea is that if there is a God, he's irrelevant to the law, and there well may not be a God. I said some things to the contrary and was greeted with hilarious and almost universal laughter my second, or maybe it was my third year. I think many of the students had concluded that if there is a God, he's irrelevant. Not all the students, there's certainly wonderful exceptions. But positive law in the United States teaches many, many students and converts them from being followers of Christ to believing that everything is relative. There are no absolutes, no truly transcendent values, that in fact, man is the measure and center of all that exists. I never accepted that intellectually, but I did have serious questions about how to apply Christian principles. I mean, some are obvious, you don't lie, but many others are far less so. One of them is that I win only by you losing. One is to strike hard and fast and with so much force, emotional force, intellectual force, that the enemy is not simply pushed back, they're really destroyed. Their case is destroyed. In some cases, people are destroyed because the results of being so intimidated can have a profound effect on people that they carry for the rest of their lives. So through anger and aggression and being smart and working hard, you win. And I felt that I had to win, because if I didn't win, I'd be a failure. And I could become like my father. And that I was not going to do. That would hurt not only me, it would have a profound impact on my family. What I didn't know until I began to see it in my own life and to reflect on it as I look back was that anger and that emotional energy, that cross-examination, that adversarial attitude spilled over onto my family and onto others. People I would have given my life for, and yet I hurt them without even knowing it at the time. And so that was a lie that was that had unintended consequences. Well, God is so merciful, and despite me not deserving it, he worked with me to replace those three lies with truths. He did that in part by calling us to leave our home country and move to the former Soviet Union, Kyiv, Ukraine specifically. We were sitting in church one Sunday morning in Nashville, Tennessee, and people at our church had gone to Ukraine, to Kyiv, to deliver wheelchairs to people who were physically disabled there. And they talked about the looks on their faces and the reaction of those people as they rolled them out of their flats into the sunshine, and just loved them, just willed their good in all kinds of ways, not expecting anything from them in return, but just being living embodiment of Christ's love. And during that service, which was in a very staid kind of church where people didn't show much emotion at all, I began to cry because I felt that this love for these people that I had had no interest in prior, at least for any long period of time, didn't really know much about the Slavic world. But I began to feel this pure love for people. And I knew that that love couldn't have been generated by me. It was too pure. So I concluded that that must be God that had given me that, and that must mean that we were supposed to go to Kyiv and do something to help those people and others. So I went to my wife after service ended, and I said, I think we're supposed to move to Kyiv and do something that the Lord will show us to do. And she looked at me. She was not the kind of person who wanted to leave a very comfortable life that we had there in Brentwood, Tennessee, for me to give up a law practice. And she said, I felt the same thing. So over lunch, we announced to our 4 daughters that we were going to move to Kyiv. No, it was not a subdivision there in Nashville, and no, they didn't have a pool. It was a city in another country, in a very different place, because God had called us. My next to youngest daughter, Jennifer, asked us what calling was, and we said, well, there's a general call and there's a specific call. And we talked about the general call, and she accepted Christ that day and has been a follower of his since then. We're very proud of how God is using her and her other daughters. So we left, we went to Kyiv, and we eventually founded a Center for Leadership Development to teach people to be servant leaders. The first time I had my interpreter stop me when I said servant leadership, she said, in Russian, that is an oxymoron. A servant is stepped on by the leader, and how can one person be stepping on themselves? It makes no sense. And so we invited real servant leaders, all of them believers in Christ, from all over the world, from theologians to theoretical mathematicians, astronaut, an investment banker, many, many others who lived out their commitment to Christ in their professions as well as in their personal lives and families. And we saw wonderful results, and we're so proud of how God has transformed many of our students and others through them, and how they're now in many countries following the Lord in law and business, and in the ministry of pastoral and evangelists and so many others. So I learned through that many things, but one was that there was a great deal of suffering in the country at that time. They had experienced hyperinflation. Many of our students could speak English, and therefore they could earn money, but because of the economic disruptions, many of their parents had lost their jobs, their grandparents. In some cases, our students were getting up, going to university, working, and then coming to the center and supporting their entire families. And there was a lot of suffering in the country, a lot of deprivation. And so my choice was to either enter into the joys as well as the sufferings of the students and their families and others, or to keep them at arm's length so I could protect myself and not be vulnerable. I saw that in order to teach servant leadership, we had to enter into their sufferings as well as their joys. And so God showed me that what I previously believed, that allowing yourself to feel the joys and the sufferings of others is just wrong. It is dangerous. You are more vulnerable. If you love, you're more vulnerable. But the only other option is a form of death. And thus, he replaced that lie with the truth. The next huge event in my life was a serious trial. I experienced a grand mal seizure. That's electrical abnormal activity in the brain. It was not fatal in my case, but it was had a profound impact on my brain. In the middle of the night, had this seizure. I woke up in a hospital and I couldn't stay still. I couldn't think. I had to be moving every second. I'd lost a great deal of my motor skills. I was an emotional wreck, in huge anxiety and depression, but really certainly not capable of doing any productive work. My wife took a job so we could have some financial support, and I moved in with my mother, who lived across town, and I moved into her living room, and it was a room that was dark and very quiet. I wasn't disturbed there, and I lay on her couch. That's where I slept. That's where I lived. I lost a great deal of weight. I was in a constant state of just incredible emotional pain. And I realized that I was not productive, that I had abandoned my family, in the sense I had become my father. And no matter how hard I tried to think, to be able to function at a reasonable level, I just really couldn't. My wife came to me on Christmas Eve, and she said, Jim, you got to come home. Tomorrow's Christmas. The girls really need to see you and be with you on Christmas Day. And I said, I can't. I can't let them see me like this. And she said, you need to understand that they're going to love you even when you can't help them, even when you're weak, you're broken. And I love you, and God loves you. It's not dependent on what you do for us. And I went home, and it was true. They accepted me in a broken condition, and they embodied God's love for me when I could not produce anything. And so that second lie fell, that I was the sum of my performance. And that was a huge thing in my life. Welcome back, everyone. You'll recall that we ended the first half of this session with talking about two truths that had replaced two of the three lies that we talked about. The third lie was that though God teaches us all these principles, it's very difficult to actually implement them in real life. Can you minimize this? We talked about the fact that I started work at the trucking company. We had terrible accidents, and we talked about Jesus saying, treat others as you would wish to be treated if the roles were reversed. And the question is how to apply that in the rough and tumble world of high stakes business, cutthroat competition, lawyers that are out to get your scalp on the other side. How do you do that? Well, number one is take the initiative, be the first mover. And this applies not just to situations of law and business, but this is applicable to any relationship in any context, really. If you're alienated, if the other side seems to hate your guts, and the other side you've got a bad history, or the competitor in a business has really been brutal to you in the past, the way our personality is built is that we want to protect ourselves and not reach out to them. Just do it anyway. Be the first mover. Christ was consistently the first mover in history and is always the first mover with us in ways that are unspeakably beautiful. And so what I did in this case is I went to the CEO and talked to him, and he told me, you have my permission to do unorthodox things. And so I called the defense counsel and others, and I said, so I'm going to go meet with plaintiff's counsel, in many cases fly across the country, come into your jurisdiction, and tell them about a new way that we want to handle these cases. And they said, you know, Jim, I really appreciate your motives, but that could really be hurtful to Covenant. They will take that as you being desperate. They will take that as you being weak. And you better be very careful. I can't advise you to do that. I'd say just give me the case. We'll handle it like we've been handling it. And don't come out here. It's going to hurt you. Well, we did it anyway. The second thing is, if you're going to be a transformational change agent, define success. In my case, success was being a living demonstration of Christ's teaching and his power and relationship with us, even in very difficult situations where a member of a family has been killed through, in many cases, the negligence of our driver. Not all cases. Sometimes it's the other person's fault and our driver did absolutely nothing wrong. They came across the median and hit our truck. But in those cases where it is our driver's fault, then the idea was to reach out and take responsibility and do the right thing. That was the goal. That's how I define success. You know, I think one of the most important things that I have learned in life is actually very simple, but really profound in its application. And that is, my daughters who may be watching me at this moment will say, Dad, we've heard this 1,000 times, but they know it's true. The answers don't matter until you ask the right questions. The answers don't matter until you ask the right questions. And one of those questions is, what is success? What's success in my life? What's success in this new job? What's success as CEO of this company? What is success? You say, well, everyone knows what success is. We all know that. How would we pursue something if we don't even know the end we have in mind? It's just not true. Let's take just a moment to consider success in our own lives. Go with me to a place where there is a funeral. We enter the chapel. There's a casket in the front of the room. Your family and your closest friends are there. Your colleagues from work. And there's a pastor. And the service starts. The pastor says some beautiful things about the Lord and about you, and then a member of your family rises and goes up and talks a bit about you. And they say the truth. What would you want them to be able to truthfully say? Think about all the things you don't care if they say. It couldn't matter to you less if they say that at your funeral. All the things that concern us so much, all the things we work so hard for, strive so much for, that we wouldn't even want them to mention because it's not significant enough. What are the things that really would thrill you if they could say that truthfully? What about your colleagues? Friends, old friends. There was a story published in a paper about a man who had a great factory, and he made a lot of dynamite. And in fact, I think he was the inventor, or his company originated a very powerful form of dynamite. And this story in the paper called him the Merchant of Death or some such name. Talked about how effectively his product had killed so many people. The author of that article was mistaken. It was his brother that had died instead of him. But the man who was in that business read the article, and he considered the question I just asked you. What would he want people to be able to truthfully say? That he was the merchant of death? He founded an organization to promote peace and to promote a lot of things, but peace chief among them. And he funded it with a great deal of his money, sold assets, and so now that organization looks around the world each year and makes a gift to a person who has promoted peace. And that's what that man is remembered for. And that's what I'm sure he was happy that he would actually have done, not just be remembered by. His name was Alfred Nobel. He started the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, most of us are not going to be remembered like Alfred Nobel, but whether we're remembered by great masses of people or our name is known worldwide really doesn't matter. What will God say to us when we stand before him? And what would we want our family to say, those who we really love, and our friends and our colleagues? And just as importantly, what do we don't care if they say? That takes us a long way toward defining success. And an afternoon sitting in a quiet place with a piece of paper and prayer might help us do that. And you say, well, still, I mean, don't most people know what success is for them? There's a professor, he's recently passed away, but Clay Christensen taught for many years at Harvard Business School. And here's what he said about that. It's quite startling that a significant fraction of the 900 students that Harvard Business School draws each year from the world's best have given little thought to the purpose of their lives. I apply the tools of econometrics a few times a year, but I apply my knowledge of the purpose of life every day. It is the single most useful thing I have ever learned. I promise my students that if they take the time to figure out their life purpose, they'll look back and say it was the most important thing they discovered at Harvard Business School. This professor was voted the single most influential business thinker in the world by a very reputable organization. He was probably the most popular professor, or certainly among the most popular professors at Harvard Business School. Because he dealt with these kinds of issues and challenged students in these ways, he was asked to give the graduation for Harvard Business School. And he spoke about these things at great length. You would think the students wouldn't want to hear from him when he had said that they hadn't even asked the most basic questions. But they did, because they knew he was right. And his message resonated with them to such a profound degree that it then went around the world. The Harvard Business Review reprinted an article which was based on that message, and it became the most republished article in the history of the Harvard Business Review. But it wasn't just business people and academics that were drawn to this question. It was also condensed, and it became a very important Reader's Digest article and was read by people around the world. Clay then wrote a book about it, and it's really all based around a simple question. How do you define success? And when you know what success is for your life, and we have extraordinary capabilities to define success because of the unique opportunities we're given through Christ and our relationship with God, it will change things, and it will provide a foundation for you to become a profoundly influential servant leader and transformational leader. The third thing is that I learned was be authentic, and that's just aligning your identity, your real identity, the identity that is aligned with that great purpose, but your identity as a follower of Christ and your purpose that he gives us, that the calling that we've learned about, and other ways he gives us purpose in ways large and small, with the principles that you base your life on, with your words, your attitudes, and your actions. When those things are aligned, that's another word for integrity. But the word that I think is used more often is being authentic. We live in an age which is desperate for authenticity. I mean, so many of the people that are before us on our screens and eminent people in our societies are images. They've been created. Who they are in reality is very different than who they appear to be. And people know it. It's not just them. I mean, individuals now have image consultants in some big cities. And it's just, there's a lot of, I'm told, I don't go on FaceTime much, but I'm told that a lot of people appear on Facebook, to be, see, maybe you're dealing with here. They appear to be one kind of person, have one kind of family and one kind of life on Facebook, when in fact, the people that know them say, that's not who they are at all. So there's a desperate thirst for, there's desperate thirst for all these things that we're talking about, even among very secular publics and even among very cynical anti-theists. I've really found this in lots of places. And they're desperate to know it's sincere people, authentic people. I had a girl in one of the Harvard Business School classes. After I spoke, she was heard to say, as she was exiting the room to a friend, I now know I'll never know what to do until I know who I am. Well, I think what she meant was, I don't really have an identity. I'm sort of a series of images. I don't really know what's important. And until I know that, until I know who I am, and we also know whose we are, until I've really discovered my true identity, I can't really come up with a meaningful purpose. So if you're sincere and genuine, you'll only say what you really mean, just practically speaking. And then you'll be honest in the sense that what you do say will match your actions. And that's something that is so important as I deal with the attorneys and the families and representing the company that had the truck that caused this profound loss in the family, this death. I once facilitated the rapid settlement. It's an agreement where all the parties agree this is what will be the amount of money that's given and what will happen because this accident was caused by the driver of this company. And it was a very large conflict, and it was with a very famous plaintiff's attorney. And he settled the case very quickly when we met. It was in a city. And when I went back, there was what's called a neutral present. He's called a mediator, but he doesn't represent either side. He just tries to help the two sides come to an agreement. And he was sort of astonished that this lawyer agreed to a settlement so quickly. It was not the way he had normally done things. In fact, this neutral said, I've done over 4,000 mediations. This is the first time I've ever seen what just happened here. And I said, what do you mean? What? And he said, you didn't say a single word that wasn't the absolute truth. From the time you walked into the room and talked to this gentleman, there were big crowds in both rooms. There were lots of people on his side and lots of people on my side. And I asked to just have the two of us go away with the neutral. And he said, you just told the truth. You talked about the weaknesses of your case every bit as much as you talked about the strengths. And he said, you just took all the anger, all the emotion out and made a reasonable offer. And that's the reason it settled so quickly. You might become a solvent for cynicism. In the age of cynicism, you'll just be in all kinds of different environments where you'll just make it dissolve. Say the fourth thing I learned is building strong relationships. How do you do that? In my context, as I said, I go visit the attorneys and the families. If the attorneys want the families to be present, often we'll have a meeting with the family and their attorney in the office, a shorter meeting when I will convey genuine condolences on behalf of the company and the families that are involved and the driver. And sometimes I get a very emotional response. If you tell a grieving mother who lost her daughter in a tragic accident because of the negligence of a person driving a truck, she may scream at you for a long time. She may slide 8x10 color photographs of her daughter across the table to you at her graduation and a picture of her casket. If you listen with your heart as well as your head and do the best that you can do to treat her as if she were your mother and you were the one who had died, as you would want your mother to be treated if the same had happened to you, good things will happen. Will everything be restored? Of course not. But genuine, authentic. I just do practical things like if we're responsible for an accident and we're still investigating the accident, it's going to take time to understand exactly what happened. I may go to the plaintiff's attorney and say, the breadwinner of this family has died. The other spouse is left. They've got 3 young kids. We don't want them to lose their health insurance because the wife is also needs medical care. We want to take care of those even before the case is settled. We don't want them to lose their house because, why would we want them to go through post-accident harm when they're in this fragile state? It's just not right. And we don't want you to settle the case or give us some advantage because we're writing you a check, but we want this check to go through to the family, and here it is. Whatever the number is, $30,000, $50,000, whatever is required to keep them not suffering unnecessary post-accident harm. And if the case goes to trial, we won't submit this, so we try to get a set-off on a verdict. And if we settle the case, we will not ask you to reduce the amount of the settlement by this. And you're not releasing any of your rights. I'll give you a letter. This doesn't change any legal position. It doesn't do away with anything from their side. We just want to stop a little of the suffering, which we know they must be going through, because we can do that. And it's what we would want to be done if this was our family. we take large amounts of information, big 3-ring binders full of paper showing the driver's past and driving record and the equipment that was involved and the hours of service and how long they've been on and on and on and on, and give those to the plaintiff's attorney many times at our first or second meeting. And in many cases, the normal procedure is that they would have taken a long, long time and battling over how much we had to give them, how much they had to give us. And we sometimes take someone with us. So we say, okay, here's the technical guy. If you don't understand all these rows of numbers, ask him a question. And oftentimes the plaintiff's lawyers are just astonished. It's the first time this has ever happened in their career. The facts are the facts, and we want to be objective about this. And so we thought we'd just show up with all this and we could talk about both of us understanding what really happened. How about this one? This is really shocking to some plaintiff's attorneys. The guys on the other side, the guys on my side are called defense attorneys, plaintiff's attorneys on the other side representing the families. And very often, let's say there's a medical expert or an accident reconstruction expert, but you get very smart people, engineers or doctors, to say, yeah, this equipment failed or it didn't fail, or yes, this person suffered this injury, or no, they already had this condition before the accident. And so defense lawyers hire defense experts and plaintiff's lawyers hire plaintiff's experts. Well, not in all cases, but in some cases, they hire them over and over and over. Defense uses certain ones over and over. The plaintiff uses certain ones over and over. They're medical doctors. They usually get paid very large fees for rendering their medical opinion about this person suffer this condition as a result of the accident, or those kinds of questions. So in order to try to get to the real objective truth, I sometimes suggest that both sides get their normal experts, and instead of just the experts, as you can imagine, not surprisingly, a lot of times the defense experts think one way and their report says, you know, it wasn't caused by this person, or no, this is a pre-existing condition, and the plaintiff's experts say just the opposite. So why don't we just get them both to agree on a third expert that doesn't normally do this, doesn't normally give testimony or make these opinions, but they're highly respected as really knowing their stuff. And why don't we get them to issue an opinion, if we want to have the other experts give theirs, but have them agree, you know, everyone knows that this is a person that's objective and very, very knowledgeable. And sometimes that brings about us knowing what the truth is, when it would be a bit more difficult to do otherwise, a joint expert. Sometimes treating others as you would wish to be treated, applying biblical principles in tough environments, is just absorbing insults and cynicism without an equal and opposite reaction. I get really insulted, but I just basically check my ego at the door. Christ says, turn the other cheek. I understand that, and the way I think of it is just check your ego at the door. It's the same thing, I think. Do my best with God's help to respond with quiet compassion and with practical ways to help all the parties get to a conclusion that is fair, that treats the family with the dignity that they deserve, having lost a family member in an accident, that really it's the right thing. When people are hurting in grief or other kinds of hurt, if you add hatred and animosity and battles and technical gamesmanship through your lawyers on top of that, and you create hatred on top of grief or other kinds of suffering, whether it's from a war or business failure or a terrible accident, it destroys human beings. It's like an acid eating away at your soul. So doing what we can to absorb criticism and go back with constructive suggestions quietly without beating our chest or making threats is a way of sort of putting what Christ said into action in very practical ways in very tough environments. Often I will ask the lawyer on the other side to share a meal with me, and I'll get to know them as a human being. Very often those meetings last 2 or 3 hours, and it's very unusual to have this happen. But I find that as you break bread, and as Christ did with people, it creates a different environment, and it can be used in many different contexts. And at least in my society, it's highly unusual, but I think it creates a different atmosphere. Sometimes when we go to meet with a lawyer and the family who's lost a loved one, and I asked my daughter, who for almost 10 years served as my paralegal, to go with me. And she's a person who's a devout follower of our Lord and has a profound compassion for others. And so if we have a meeting and we have one family, it's really talking to another family. And there's an interaction there that is more authentic and more full-orbed instead of just legal positioning. I think people just know when you have your daughter or a member of your family present. A lot of people think, well, even if this person isn't genuine, they're going to be far more reluctant to say something and try to be false or tricky if a member of their own family is present. It just creates a different atmosphere. I think that's can't be used in all circumstances. It's very unusual for it to happen in our circumstance. Almost never happens, but we just did it anyway. And I want to say that it's a practical way of applying the things that we believe in certain cases. Then just so we talked about loving a person, love your neighbor as you love yourself, as one of the key teachings of our Lord, and willing the good of others. And what that means in our context is don't negotiate an unfair amount, unfairly low. I have what I call a range of reasonableness, and I encourage my client not to ever get below the lower end of that range. There's no one number. Who knows? It's not a specific number, but there's a range that is reasonable, and you need to be within that range and just treat others. It's another function of treating them as you would wish to be treated, and you do it with dollars or lira or pounds or euros. Listen, really listen. Sometimes it's the single most important thing you can do. It's very important where people are in suffering. This, if someone's died and someone else has been injured in your family, you've lost a brother or father, a mother, a sister, a child. Listen with your heart as well as your head. A lot of times, lawyers at least, we listen with our heads and we're already thinking of our response. And I think maybe we're really bad about that, worse than normal, but I think it happens a lot. To listen with your heart is different. You don't even focus on the specific words the person says, especially if they're not articulate. You listen to what they would say if they knew how to say it. Much harder. You would listen to what they're afraid to say and so won't say. You would listen to the groans that really can't be put into words, the hopes, very hard to articulate, those hidden interests that very seldom get put into words. You listen for that. My wife called me one day. I was an extremely busy time of my life. I mean, so busy that I was rarely home. I went home to sleep. And I was in a very public situation, being examined by the press. And sometimes my family almost had to contact me through people on my staff. And she said, Jim, you need to come home. We need to talk. And I said, I'd love to, and she said, no, you need to come home and we need to talk. And I said, okay. Yeah. She said, now, is it an emergency? No, but we need to talk. So I went home, middle of the day. I sat across the kitchen table from her, only a few feet away. And there were all kinds of things with the kids and with life. And I was in a public spotlight. And so the kids it has implications for kids, and some good and some bad. And she was just worn out. She was at her wit's end, as we say. And she talked, and I kept good eye contact with her. And after she had talked, I don't know how long it was, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, I don't know. She got still and looked at me with a look that I didn't like. And she said, tell me one word, I said. And I had been thinking about 10 different things, all of which were urgent. And I couldn't tell her one thing she had said. I'm very ashamed of that. I still wasn't too smart, so I decided I would turn on a tape recorder in my head whenever she spoke to me. So if she ever did that again, I could repeat word for word her last sentence or two. She did ask me again, and I just repeated it back. And I said it word for word. And she said, you're not listening to me. I said, I just repeated what you said. She said, you're not listening to me. And then she'd go away, hurt. It took a long time. I'm really slow on the learning score sometimes, just really dumb, to know that she wanted me to hear her heart. She wanted me to hear what she couldn't say. She wanted me to not necessarily try to even give her a solution to the problems that she was stating. She wanted me to empathize. She wanted me to understand. She wanted me to share her burdens, her feelings with her, to just be with her, to hear her heart. I'm now in my practice and hopefully in my life and doing that better through God's grace. So I found that that's very important in working with families who've lost loved ones. Really, really listen and care. And that's just a very practical way of loving your neighbor, whether it's your wife or someone who's encountered a tragedy or just any problem that they're dealing with. The other thing that's huge in carrying out Christ's view of what is good and true and right, and in loving people and loving Him and building the kingdom, replacing lies with truth and darkness with light, is building trust. And there's academic literature about how to do that, and there's practical literature in the professions, and people talk about micro movements and specific skills you can develop and body language, and oh, it's a big industry. How to build trust. Skillful trust building. I say earn trust by being trustworthy. Don't worry about the skills. Be authentic. Do what you say. Earn trust. And that's a very practical way of doing to others as you would wish it to be done to you. When things go well, thank God. It's a gift. Sometimes if I have a victory and someone compliments me, I'll say, well, anything good in that was from above. I'm responsible for the rest, because that's really true. But realize that it was a gift from God, and certainly not a reason for any pride. When things go badly, trust God anyway. It's a real way when people see that from you, and especially if you're in a leadership position, that has a transformative effect on them, because that's not the normal way things are done. Fifth, I would say one of the things I've learned is to identify the real interest and obstacles. That should be obvious, but for instance, in my context, it's sometimes believed that all the family wants and all their lawyer wants is money, a lot of money. Well, in fact, I've found that if you build these relationships that I've talked about, doing the right thing and showing them that you really are working hard to treat them as you would wish to be treated, a relationship grows up and you'll learn things you would never have learned otherwise. This has happened so many times. And sometimes what people want, yes, they want a fair amount of money, but they really want to know that justice was done. And you can help justice to be done by giving this information to their attorney so that they can understand what really happened. That you offer fair compensation instead of unreasonably low compensation. Justice. Sometimes the family just wants someone to hear them. Sometimes their own attorneys don't. They get the facts, they do this, they do that. And this is not always the case, but sometimes the attorney doesn't ask them the question of, how has your life changed? And really listen. So ask the questions that may normally be considered embarrassing, but if they're appropriate, go ahead and ask them, even if it's unorthodox. And listen, as we've talked about listening. Sometimes a family wants to know that they've helped some other family avoid this tragedy. What can they do to help the drivers understand what a moment of looking down to adjust their radio, or a moment of inattention, can cost a family, what that really cost? One of the things that you can do in that context is ask the family if they would be willing to appear on a video and just talk about the cost to their family of losing their husband or their wife or their mother or their father or their daughter or their son. And then show that video to all the drivers in your training, so they really experience that family's grief and understand the enormous implications of a moment of negligence, of inattention when they're driving those big rigs. That's a real interest that family has in helping others not go through what they've gone through. And these are asymmetric exchanges. they create human and moral as well as economic value. And an asymmetric exchange, the cost to one side to do that video and to show it to all their drivers is negligible, but it has a huge value over here. Or letting the family see the facts and just being free about the facts so that they know that justice is done. Well, the economic cost of that is, I would argue, negligible. I mean, the facts are going to come out if you try the case anyway. Why not just go ahead and just be upfront? I mean, move the whole process forward. Sometimes these asymmetric exchanges are just hugely important, and you can create a lot of kinds of value in a single transaction. Then another thing I've learned is to develop and cast a vision. When I go in and meet with attorney on the other side, many times they have never been approached with a proposal like this in their entire career, even if they've been in the practice for a long time, and many of the attorneys I deal with have. So I take the initiative, and then I fly across the country. I meet them face to face. I invite them to a meal, and the meal lasts 2 or 3 hours, and we get to know one another. And near the end of that meal, I cast a vision for what would happen if we did this very differently. Would you want to explore with me us just exchanging information, having joint experts, doing, us just being able to help the family on the front end, not asking anything in return, and not putting them through a lot of terrible depositions or even a trial where the attorneys are asking questions. Oh, you didn't really love this person. You all were separated for 3 years a year ago, and just building hatred and piling that on top of grief. What happens if we just step up and do the right thing? And then hand them a check and a letter saying, here's no strings money, and here's all this information. And that's never happened in their career, and proving that I'm ready to move forward with this idea of us working jointly to solve this problem of valuation of a legal claim instead of going to war. They don't call these proceedings in court trials for nothing. They are a trial, especially on a grieving family. And casting that vision, you're going to take some risks if you do that, in whatever the context. If you're doing something different, something that's not in the norm, the status quo is very powerful, and people are just, how it's been done for so long, will try to crush you. You'll be upsetting people. You'll be disturbing vested interests, which are sometimes very powerful. Do it anyway. Develop and cast a vision, and show practical steps of whoever you're proposing it to. Not just a grand vision, but here's proof. Here's the first proof. I'll take the first steps to show I'm really going to follow through with this. Have you ever had this happen to you before? No. Well, would you? I'm not asking you to trust me. Just take the first step with me. Would you do this? This will benefit both sides. Let's get a joint expert, and so we can really understand the mechanical issues. We can really understand the medical conditions. And very often, much more often than I would have thought, they'll do it hesitantly, sometimes with great cynicism, sometimes insultingly, sometimes very graciously. But they will engage, and very, very often, much more than I would have thought possible, this can be done, even though it is so unusual. Many times after we conclude an agreement using this new golden rule, that's not new at all, the attorney will say to me, I have never concluded a dispute like this in my career, but I just want to tell you, this was refreshing. And I think that's transformative in its own way. And then don't be afraid to ask for a commitment. If you're proposing a new business model for a company or a new type of ministry for a nonprofit, a new emphasis for a church, whatever it is, a new thing for the government to undertake, ask for the commitment or ask for the funding that would be necessary for this to have any chance. Try to go to the decision maker instead of work through intermediaries. If you can work your way to that, if there is a single decision maker or decision makers, ask. It's amazing the number of people when I was in the nonprofit world that have wonderful ideas, but they will not ask for board members. They will not ask for money. They will not ask for to cooperate with the government in a certain way. They have great ideas, but they're just hesitant to ask. So ask for a commitment. Don't be afraid. Here's the thing. Once you have your identity more and more established in Christ, you can take risks that you couldn't take otherwise. If your identity is based on your performance, you're only as good as your last quarter of financials. You're only as good as your last big project. You're only as good at, if you believe that lie that I started believing when I was 8 or 9 or 10, my value, my core identity is the sum of my performance. You are in a very fragile position. You're afraid to take risks because your whole life is on the line. If your trust and your identity is in Jesus Christ and his being ever present, your relationship with him and your work with him and this great romance, this great enterprise that he calls his kingdom, the rule of his effective will, then you can take risks without risking yourself. It's very important to have the right person ask for the commitment, for the sign-off, whatever it is. That person needs to be consistent with the things that we've discussed above and ask for the right reasons and in the right way. We could talk for a whole session about what that means, but I'll just mention those here. And finally, after you ask, be still. Stop speaking, even if you're a lawyer. I know it's hard. Stop moving. Pray. Wait. When we treat others as we would wish to be treated, God can bring beautiful healing and transformation of not only individuals and families, but institutions, companies, universities, great enterprises, societies. But no matter how big the transformation he lets you be involved in, never forget the individuals. I met with a lady and her 2 grandchildren at a rehabilitation facility. Her son had been killed in an accident that was caused by a client's vehicle. Her daughter-in-law was learning to hang clothes on a line. That was her highest level of cognitive functioning because of a severe cognitive brain injury. I treated that woman with God's help and her 2 little grandchildren as I would want my mother to be treated if I had been killed. Her lawyer called me later. He was there the whole time, and he said, my client wants to fire me and hire you. And I said, you can't do that. He's on the other side. But I cared about her, was honest with her, and she knew it. Somehow God gave her the grace to come to me after that case was settled and say, tell the driver I know he didn't mean to kill my son and hurt my daughter-in-law. Tell him I forgive him. That's what a transformative leader is after. And those grandchildren's lives will be different because the grandmother that is raising them has forgiven and loved in the face of tragedy instead of learned to hate. Thank you.